"What's wrong with you?" said Balaban, throwing up his hands in exasperation. "Fall on your knees and thank Allah. Why are you always asking questions? When you are drowning, you grab onto a snake. You don't say, 'Are you a good snake or a bad one? Let me take a look at you first.'" Shortly before dawn, Jahan heard footsteps, then the key turned in the lock to his cell. 2 guards entered. They took off his chains, helped him to his feet. Despite what he had heard from Balaban, the first and only thing that came to his mind was that they were going to execute him. Seeing his reluctance, they pushed him, though more gently than they had on other days. Their compassion confirmed his fear. "Are you going to hang me?" "Nay, imbecile. You're free to leave." In disbelief, Jahan walked towards Balaban's cell. The gypsies were asleep. It upset him to go without saying goodbye. He took off the handkerchief the chieftain had wrapped round his head and tied it to the iron bars. He glanced at Kamak, who just then muttered something inaudible. Lying nearby, Abdullah was sleeping peacefully, seemingly incapable of the violence that was within him. They strode along the corridors, up the stairs. As they ascended the floors, all Jahan could think about was who had saved him and why. Outside there was a carriage waiting for him. "Where are we going?" he asked the coachman. "I've been ordered to take you to my lady Mirama." Thus he discovered who had rescued him. From the coach window he stared at the haze over the sea, the dark green of the pine trees, the kites with their forked tails soaring high on a breeze. Everything was as he had left it. At the same time nothing was the same. When one underwent a sudden change, one expected the world, to somehow have become different. Poking out his head, he called to the coachman, "I can't go in this state. I beg you, take me to a hammam." "No, I've got orders to take you to my sultana straight away." "Effendi, have mercy. How can I let her see me like this?" The coachman shrugged. He didn't care. "You should have thought of that earlier," he said harshly. At these words Jahan was incensed. He no longer had any patience for heartless people. "Now you listen to me. I have just walked out of a dungeon. If need be, I'll walk back into it. But before that I'll kill you." The coachman grumbled. Even so, fearing an ex-convict, he stopped the carriage at the next square and swerved into a side street, looking for the nearest hammam. The hammam owner did not want to let Jahan in and did so only after being bribed by the coachman. The moment the hot water touched his skin, Jahan winced with pain. The warmth of the marble against his toes felt like walking on clouds. He shaved for the first time in 6 weeks. The telek, a hulky Kurd, was either irate at an injustice he had suffered just that morning or had consumed too much spice, for he scrubbed too hard, his fingers working swiftly, scarlet rings forming around his wrists from the exertion. When he was done, Jahan's skin was as red as poppies. The odor and filth of the dungeon seeped out of his skin in black specks. Dizzy, he stood up and tottered through the mist towards the dais outside. It felt cool and fresh after the steaming hot inner chamber. They offered him wild strawberry sherbet. While sipping his drink, for want of anything better to do, he glanced around. There was a stout man with a ruddy complexion, a merchant probably, half asleep. Another man with darting eyes and a scar that ran down his cheekbone was sitting on the edge, dangling his legs, which were covered, for the most part, with a peshtamal. The Kazakh next to him scrutinized Jahan and, not finding him of interest, turned his back. In a while 2 boys appeared, their faces devoid of hair, their eyes big and bright. It was the stocky man who had summoned them. Jahan knew what was going on. In the private rooms boys performed services for chosen customers. Jahan thought of Kamak and Abdullah. His back tightened, his mouth twisted into a grimace. A voice muttered in his ear, "You don't like boys." A man had plumped himself down on the marble beside Jahan. His chest, arms, legs, even his shoulders were covered by dark tufts of hair. "I don't like what's happening," Jahan said. Though he nodded as if in agreement, the man responded with a grin. "You know what they say, boys in the summer, wives in the winter to keep you warm. I'd rather get a thin blanket in the summer and a quilt in the winter." The man chuckled but said no more. Before he left the hammam, Jahan put on the robes the coachman had arranged. He saw the 2 boys outside, whispering. One of them holding an axe as though it were the key to a secret world. That same afternoon, as he entered Miramah's mansion on the shores of the Bosphorus, he was engulfed by a nervous excitement. So it hadn't gone numb. His heart. Taking short breaths to steady himself, he knelt before her. "Look at you." Her hand flew to her mouth. "You are all bones." Jahan dared to glance up at her. Around her neck was a rope of pearls that caught the sun every time she moved. Her dress was of pure sarzenet, the color of an evergreen. A married woman, she carried herself differently now. Behind her light veil she was beautiful, and sad. Never had anyone's sorrow been so sweet. She was worried for him. Perhaps she even loved him. He felt as if his heart would break. Ordering dish after dish, she urged him to taste everything. Stewed mutton, stuffed vine leaves, prunes in syrup, sugared almonds of various colors. There was something on a tiny plate Jahan had never had before, caviar. Fate was odd. The day before he was drawing designs on the floor with shit. Now he was perched on silk cushions, eating caviar from the hand of his beloved. And as he closed his eyes for a moment, he could not tell which was real and which someone else's life. "You used to tell me stories," Miramah said, in a voice that barely rose above a whisper. "Do you remember?" "How could I forget, Your Highness? Everything was different back then. We were only children. One needs to be a child to revel fully in a tale, don't you think? Still, even as adults we can." She was about to say more when her words were interrupted by the sound of footsteps on the great staircase. Jahan's back straightened, as it occurred to him that it could be her husband, Rustem Pasha. When he turned his head he saw Hesna Khatun with a little girl by her side. The child made a deep obeisance before her mother and fixed her large brown eyes on Jahan. "Aisha, my delight, I want you to greet our guest. He is a talented architect. He and Master Sinan made those beautiful mosques that we always talk about." "Yes, mother," the child said without a trace of interest. "He has also taken care of the white elephant," Miramah added. Aisha's face lit up. "Are you the one who helped the elephant to drink his mama's milk?" Jahan drew in a breath. The stories he had once told Miramah, she must have recounted to her daughter. The realization made him smile, as if he had penetrated the intimacy of this house and become a part of its bedtime conversations without even knowing. Over the child's head his eyes met Miramah's. An understanding passed between them, like a soft rustle of wind. "Would Your Excellency like to come to see the elephant someday, Jahan?" asked the girl. Aisha pursed her lips, as if to say she might or she might not. Instead of looking at her mother for permission, she glanced up at Hesnakatan, who had been in the background, silently watching them. Jahan's eyes moved to the nursemaid. She had aged, her cheeks had shriveled up like withered leaves. But even the unmistakable sternness of her gaze didn't disrupt Jahan's line of thinking. This was what his life could have been like if only he had been fortunate enough to be in Rustem Pasha's shoes. This girl would be his daughter, these walls his shield against the world, this splendid view from the window the reality he woke up to every morning, and the princess he secretly loved, his official wife. Never before, not even in his darkest hours in the dungeon, had he wished for another man's death the way he did now. He caught a blur of movement. Hesnakatan was staring at him with unblinking eyes, her lips moving fast, as if she were talking to someone. Jahan's skin turned to goose flesh. He knew she had read his mind, though he couldn't explain how, and that she would find some way of using this against him. The day after he was released from prison, Jahan woke up with heaviness in his heart. He blinked a few times, unable to grasp where he was. The tamers were up and about, and, from behind the closed door, he could hear the growl of a leopard. Dragging himself out of the bed, he lurched into the courtyard and splashed water on his face from the fountain. A drizzle fell on the heather, pearly drops like dew. There was a fresh smell in the breeze, and the animals paced lazily in their cages. Though he had spent time with Chota the preceding evening, he was eager to see him again. Later on in the day he would visit his master. He was both exuberant and nervous. He would ask Sinan why he had not come to visit him in the dungeon, and if, for some reason, he was not able to, why had he not sent a letter? By midday he reached his master's house. His melancholy oozed away as soon as he saw Sinan and the affection in his gaze. He wondered if the father he had lost had ever regarded him like that. He stooped to kiss his master's hand. But Sinan pulled him towards himself and held him in his arms. His voice breaking, he said, "Let me look at you. You are so thin, son." In a little while the blind Kaya entered the room. Her son was now being taught all of his mother's duties, and Jahan knew that one day very soon the man would be called upon to take her place. The apprentice felt a harrowing sadness, and hoped he would be able to say farewell to the old servant when the time came and ask for her blessing. "He needs to eat," Sinan said from his seat to the Kaya. "The poor boy," the old woman exclaimed, and, moving as quickly as she could, went to give orders for the meal. The servants bustled in, carrying a low table, towels, and wooden spoons. They placed in front of him bowls of honey, butter, cream, flattened bread, sour grape molasses, halva, and a jar of yogurt drink with mint and raisins. "Eat. Drink," Sinan ordered. Jahan complied, though he felt no hunger. When he could not take another bite, Sinan, who had been watching him, said quietly, "They punished you in order to get at me. Everybody knows that." Jahan was lost for words. Unaware of the bitterness fermenting in his apprentice's heart, Sinan carried on. "His Majesty wishes to reconsider the water design. I'd like you to come with me to the palace. We need to clear your name." "I don't even know what I've been accused of," said Jahan. A pause. Treachery. It wasn't horror Jahan felt in that moment, only a deep sadness. "Will Rustem Pasha be there?" he asked. Seeing the Grand Vizier's ugly face was the last thing he wanted. "No doubt. You'll have to kiss his hand, ask his forgiveness." "Can you do that?" Jahan could not answer. Instead he inquired, "I don't understand this sudden clemency. What has changed?" "That's what I've been wondering myself." There must be a reason, but I can't fathom it. All I know is that our Sultan has expressed his wish to see me. Jahan remained silent. It must have been Mirama. She must have talked to her husband and pleaded with her father, begging him to listen to the architects one last time. Hints delicate as tufts of dandelions in the wind. Everything suggested that she cared for him. Jahan lowered his head for fear his master could read his thoughts. On the day of their visit, Jahan put on new robes, light cotton chalwar, linen shirt, leather shoes, pointed at the toes. His master had bought them to help him look his best. Sinan, too, had carefully dressed in a russet kaftan and bulbous turban. The Kaya muttered the prayers she had learned from her mother almost a century ago and sprinkled rosewater blessed by 7 imams on their heads. They had been sent a royal carriage, a propitious sign, no doubt, indicating that the Sultan had some regard for them. Inside they sat, the master and the apprentice, scrolls in between them. Their stomachs tied in knots, they found it hard to talk. It was in this mood that Sinan and Jahan entered the palace. Sultan Sulayman welcomed them. On one side of him stood the hefty figure of the Grand Vizier. On the other, the Shaykh al-Islam and the Chief Janissary Aga. Their hands tightly clasped, they eyed them with a coldness they felt no need to mask. The Sultan said, "Chief Royal Architect, each of these honorable men has questions for you. Are you willing to answer?" Sinan bowed. "I'm honored, Your Felicitous Majesty." The Shaykh al-Islam, Abu Su'ud Effendi, his face as unreadable as a faded manuscript, spoke first. "In our glorious city there are bridges from the time of the infidels that have not survived. They collapsed because they were built without true faith. Do you agree?" Sinan took a breath. "God gave us a mind and told us to use it well. Many ancient bridges are in ruins because they were not built upon firm ground. When we raise a bridge we make sure the water is shallow, the earth is solid, the tides favorable. Bridges are built with faith, true, but also with knowledge." Sultan Sulayman made a gesture to his left, the signal for the Chief Janissary Aga to speak. "Majesty, your vassal Sinan seems to think he can predict how much water there is 7 layers under the ground. How is that possible? We thought he was an architect, not a necromancer. Does he also profess mastery of the occult?" Jahan blenched at the innuendo, aware of the implications of being accused of black magic. Sinan replied, "I have no experience in divination. The amount of water under the earth can be measured through the right use of instruments. These instruments he mentions, do they come from Allah? Or from Shaitan?" said the Chief Janissary Aga. "Surely from God," replied Sinan. "He wants us to expand our knowledge." The Shaykh al-Islam interjected, "Al-Qadr, may he rest in paradise, discovered water. Do you claim to be a holy man like him?" "I'm not worthy of the fingernail of a holy man," Sinan said. "Al-Qadr traveled with the prophet Moses and unraveled the secrets of the universe. Next to his knowledge, mine is a droplet of water. But I believe, using the right measurements, we can locate the invisible sources." The Sultan turned to the Grand Vizier. "What do you say, Pasha?" Rustem gave a dry cough. "I'd like to learn how much the Chief Royal Architect is planning to spend. Our treasury cannot be emptied." Expecting this question, Sinan said, "There are 2 choices. The spending will differ, depending on the wishes of my Sultan." Sulayman was intrigued. "What do you mean, architect?" "Majesty, our aim is to bring fresh water to the city. We need laborers. Hundreds of them. If you prefer, we will employ galley slaves. Then you won't have to pay them. You'll have no end of vassals. What is the second way? We hire skilled craftsmen. They'll be paid, according to their ability and service to His Majesty. In return they will give their sweat and their prayers. So he thinks he can fill the coffers with sweat and prayers. Rustem said. Ignoring the remark, the Sultan asked Sinan, which would you suggest? I believe we should pay them and get their blessings. The treasury might not be all that it was, but it's better for the throne and for the people. Jahan went pale, expecting the worst. At last, after a long, awkward silence, the Sultan raised his hand and said, the chief royal architect is right. Water is a charity and must be distributed generously. I shall give water to the people and I shall pay my workers. But with the next breath Suleiman said to Sinan, even so, I'm not allowing you to build a new bridge. Renovate the aqueducts, that's enough. The chamber stirred as each man reflected on who, if anyone, had won the argument. Sinan said, my lord, with your permission, my Indian apprentice will help me with the renovation. The Sultan ran a finger through his beard as his eyes took in Jahan. I remember him. It's good you have such a dedicated apprentice. He paused. What do you say, Pasha, shall we forgive him? The Grand Vizier, a sparkle in his eyes, extended his arm. Sinan nodded encouragingly at Jahan. Showing more determination than he felt, Jahan took a step forward as through a mist and kissed the plump hand with rings, put it on his forehead. He would have loved to swipe one of those rings, he thought. A recompense for his sufferings. May God bless your efforts, said Rustem, his icy glare at variance with the sweetness in his voice. On the way back they passed through marble corridors, the master and the apprentice. The elation that came over them was so intense that they found it hard to stay silent. Jahan knew that not only his heart had been pounding, his master, too, had been scared. Once again, Sinan had found himself in a tight spot, when all he wanted to do was his work. Once again, as though aided by an obscure well-wisher, he had been reprieved. Perhaps he had a protector, Jahan thought, a mysterious patron who interfered on his behalf each time things got too thorny, an invisible guardian angel always by his side. Back in the menagerie, Jahan found the animal tamers waiting for him with a smirk on their faces. Come with me, said Olaf, folding his arms over his chest. Where are we going, said Jahan. Don't ask, said Olaf and pulled him by the elbow. A man who's just come out of prison is a man in need of joy. To Jahan's surprise, Olaf led him towards the stables of the favored horses. Here they kept the best thoroughbreds, each of which wore round its neck a blue amulet against the evil eye. Upon seeing them approach, the chief white eunuch's beloved stallion, Tempest, neighed softly. Noble, majestic, alone. Olaf patted the animal, speaking sweet words in his ear. Will somebody tell me what's going on? Inquired Jahan nervously. You always wanted to ride this horse, didn't you? This is our gift to you. But Camel Aga. Olaf cut short his words with a raise of his hand. Don't worry, it's all arranged. He's not in the palace tonight. He's out visiting the Hammam of Sorrows. Don't ask me where that place may be, I cannot tell. But what do you expect me to do with the horse? Nothing, Olaf responded, giving a wink. Just go and ride down the hill. A little while later, a shadow shot out of the stable gates, Jahan, lying so low. His body was level with the horse's back, riding Tempest into the dark. The two Guards by the gates, having been bribed beforehand, couldn't care less. He galloped in the direction Olaf had mentioned, enjoying the wind on his face. Feeling free and reckless for once. After a bit he slowed down. There, in the near distance, was a cart, and huddled together on it were the gypsies. "What on earth?" Jahan exclaimed. "When did you get out of prison?" "Oh, we'd all been released about a month before you. We just waited with you until you were pardoned," said Balaban. "What? Why didn't you tell me?" stammered Jahan. "What are you doing here at this hour?" "The Lion Man sent us word," Balaban said, as he tethered Tempest's reins to the back of the cart. "Your friends had a chat about you, it seems. They think it's time for you to have a bit of pleasure. You deserve it." "What does that mean?" Jahan said suspiciously. The glance that the gypsies exchanged was one of amusement. "You'll see," said Balaban, and before Jahan could object he whipped the donkey. The cart set off, followed by Tempest. The cart rattled along, passing through the country lanes and the field tracks. Though it was a crisp autumn evening, with the sky a velvety black, patches of mist were rolling up northwards, edging towards the outer ends of the city. A blanket of fog swallowed the winding streets and arching bridges, and Istanbul swallowed them. They passed through alleyways, many of which were so narrow, with wooden houses on both sides buckled like saplings bent in a gale, that their axles scraped the walls as they rode by. Each neighborhood they left behind seemed quieter, mustier, and more doleful than the last. Balaban fell silent. All they heard for a long time, other than the occasional squawk from a seagull, was the clatter of hooves and wheels on the cobblestones. The wagon came to a halt and they climbed off. Taking a breath to steady himself, Jahan jumped down from the horse, looked around for a familiar sight, and found none. "Come on," Balaban said, nudging him. "Movement is a blessing." Putting his right hand on his heart, the chieftain turned to his men. "You go, God go with you." Jahan trod behind Balaban. At each step the street smells intensified, traces of jasmine mingling with the tang of the sea and the whiffs of food, briny and garlicky. Tamers learned a lot from their animals, and there was one thing Chota had hammered into him: how to sniff better. So he paid more attention to these scents in the breeze, and after a while he caught a hint of perfumed oils from a house nearby. "What is this place?" whispered Jahan. Balaban chuckled. "Don't you get it? We brought you to the bawdy house." Jahan paled. "I refuse to go." "What? You afraid of the wenches?" "We'll just go in and take a look. If you don't like what you see, we'll leave. May my blood redden the soil under your feet if I lie. Come on, Indian. After all we've gone through in the jail, listen to me." Jahan dithered. He could neither accept nor refuse. Balaban pushed him, ceaselessly talking to assuage his fear. He explained that a brothel in Istanbul was a bit like the beginning of a Turkish tale: once there was, once there wasn't. Several harlots could dwell under the same roof for months, and, just when you thought they would be there forever, they'd vanish into thin air, the house an empty shell. Then there were the wives, as poor as a mouse in a looted larder, their husbands gone to war or good for nothing, who would become strumpets, though only on certain occasions, few and far between. In most neighborhoods the women who were thought to be of easy virtue were pelted with curses and stones. Often they woke up with tar rubbed on the thresholds of their homes, slanders scrawled on their walls. At times these women could be arrested, even imprisoned. Strumpets were made to sit backwards on mules and to ride through the streets so that everybody could see what was due to the likes of them. But the Qadis were a varied bunch and just as confused as everyone else. Balaban said. As much as they loathed the harlots, they saw the trade as an evil bound to happen and a boon for the treasury, since it was taxed. The only time it was strictly forbidden was in the month of Ramadan. During the rest of the year, whoredom was the only transgression that both was and wasn't a crime. The district of Ayup had, a little while back, become strict and issued a number of decrees. Taverns were closed, as were whorehouses and coffee houses that allowed gambling. All ladies of ill repute were banished, even those who had given up the life and married. To avoid the same fate, the painted women moved from one place to another, depending on the weather. Harlotry is like the wind, said Balaban, if you try to clap it in irons, it will slip away through the holes. With that they reached the door. It was opened by a black man. Upon seeing Balaban, he bowed and said, Master, welcome. You own this place? Jahan muttered in surprise. Balaban gave the servant a frosty glance. He turned to Jahan and, raising both hands, he said, I'm a poor Romani. Do you think this a house on wheels? How can I own it? Come, let's not waste time. They were ushered upstairs, where an elderly woman, her face as wrinkled as a walnut, greeted Balaban with much esteem. Next to her was a basket, inside of which was a mother cat with 6 kittens, curled in balls, all with the same thick smoke grey coat. They were born here, she said. Each named after one of my girls. Those girls, Jahan learned, were Arab Fatima, Nefis the Venetian, Kurd Kamer, Nairan the Circassian, Zarif the Turk, Leah the Jewess, and Ani the Armenian. To their left and right, there were closed doors, from behind which Jahan could hear an occasional murmur. Balaban pushed Jahan into one of the rooms, made him sit on cushions, said he'd better go to check on the musicians and disappeared. A maid appeared carrying a tray. She had flaming hair and sad scars on both sides of her face. Her eyes had a distant look, as if in search of other, long ago evenings. She brought him water, wine and plates piled with goat's cheese, sweetened figs, roasted almonds, pickles. Placing them on a low table, she asked if there was anything else he would like. Jahan shook his head, fixing his stare on the patterns of the carpet. As soon as the maid left, 2 women walked into the room on each other's heels. One was so fat she had 3 chins. Her cheeks were round and bright red. It occurred to Jahan that if Chota had been there he would have gulped them down for apples. The thought made him smile. She beamed. You like me? No, Jahan exclaimed. Not wanting to appear rude, he added hastily, well, yes, but not like that. They giggled, she more than the other. The flesh on her belly bounced up and down. Smacking her lips, she leaned forward. I've 3 breasts and there's a monster in my belly that comes out when I'm hungry. I eat men. Jahan looked at her in horror. They broke into another peal of laughter. Could one of you call Balaban? Jahan said. I need to see him. They exchanged glances, fearing their teasing might have gone too far. The room felt hot, fusty. Rising to his feet, Jahan mumbled an apology and, like an arrow, shot out of the room. At the last moment he noticed that the women, too, had stood up and were following him. Swiftly, he closed the door and slipped the bolt on it. Outside, by the stairs, he careened into the maid, who had been carrying the tray. Are you all right? She said. You going? Yes, Choda's waiting. Is that your wife? Despite himself, Jahan smiled. Nay, he's my elephant. Huge animal. Her dark eyes brightened. I know what an elephant is. All at once the women locked in the room began to pound on the door. Jahan paled. The last thing he wanted was to be caught. He looked around in panic. Come with me, the maid said, taking him by the hand. Through a hatch at the back they reached a flight of creaky stairs. She led him to her room in the attic, where the ceiling was so low they had to stoop. Yet, under the half-moon, the view out of the window was charming, a forest of tall pine trees and, beyond that, the sea in stripes of black. From up here the water seemed like something else, soft and solid, a massive silk shawl spread round the shoulders of the city. Jahan told her what had happened downstairs, which amused her greatly. She said her name was Peri. She'd been a camp follower in times past, but not any more. After her face had been marred by a soldier who had seen such things on the battlefield that he had become sick in the head and took out his anger on harlots, no one desired her. It's not true, no man will want you, said Jahan. You're prettier than those women downstairs. She kissed him and he kissed her back, the taste of her tongue lingering in his mouth. She caressed his hair, her fingertips soft and warm against his forehead, which was creased with worry. You have never done it, have you? She asked. The deep blush on his face was enough of an answer for her. She made him lie down and slowly took off his clothes. At the touch of her lips on his skin, desire surged through him. Jahan had never known that such a kingdom of pleasure existed. Only years later would he understand how lucky he had been for having someone like her to show him the way. In the dark, while he slept next to Peri, he saw himself in an unknown land, riding Chota. They pranced on top of mansions, hopping from one roof to another. Then he saw Mirama in the distance, wearing a dress of white linen, her hair fluttering in the wind. Wait, he yelled. She did not hear. He shouted again. Every time he opened his mouth it was yet another lost scream. Shh, wake up. It took Jahan a moment to remember where he was, and when he did he was drenched in cold sweat. Dressing fast, he mumbled, I ought to go. He stopped, noticing that her face was clouding over. I'm sorry. I don't know, this, I pay you. Peri turned her head. You don't owe me anything. Jahan went close, caressed her hair. Inside him confusion was fermenting, soon to turn into the sharpest guilt. He knew he had to leave before that occurred. He didn't want Peri to witness what had happened between them, changing into regret. You've been talking in your sleep, Peri said as she opened the door. Did I disturb you? Peri ignored the question. She dwells in your heart, clearly. Whoever she is. Does she know you love her? Dazed, discomfited, Jahan left the house. He would never have dared to call this thing he felt for Mirama love, and yet when it was uttered, unveiled, by someone else, he carefully picked up the word and hugged it to his chest, not willing to let go. 130 hands were hired for the repair of the aqueducts. They worked in two teams, the first on the west wing, the second on the middle part, where the decay had been most severe. In the meantime the four apprentices, with the help of an astrolabe, measured the depths of valleys and the heights of peaks. As was his wont, Sinan ordered them to research the methods undertaken by the craftsmen of the past. They needed to understand how the Byzantines had succeeded and how they had failed if they wished to do better themselves. Davud and Yusuf, adept at the science of geometry, took the measurements of the waterways. Nicola and Jahan, trudging up and down the hills, logged all the broken canals and the clogged runnels. In some places the water rushed through a gorge because the conduits had fallen into disrepair. Water was dispersed amid green meadows, returned to the earth without having been of use to human beings. In other parts they had to find the source of the stream and excavate the conduits. They dammed the water to make it flow in a single direction, towards the city. Then, with the aid of a new ditch, they made it run the length of the dale. At every stage they measured the quantity, using brass spouts attached to tanks with sluices, calculating how much water had accumulated along the way. A week later Jahan began to notice something strange. The laborers were giving them a wide berth, reluctant to carry out the orders. The more he observed them, the more he was convinced that they were looking for excuses not to hammer a nail, carry a plank, or do the slightest thing, which, when added together, was enough to hold everything back. He pulled aside one of the draftsmen, a Kurd named Salahaddin. His wife had recently given birth to twin boys. Knowing him to be an honest man, Jahan expected him to tell the truth. "What's going on? Why's everyone slow?" Salahaddin averted his gaze. "We're workin', Effendi." "You are falling behind, why?" A little blush crept into his cheeks. "You didn't tell us there was a saint here." "Who says that?" The man shrugged, refusing to give names. Jahan tried another question. "How do they know there's a saint?" "They have seen an apparition," Salahaddin replied, glancing at Jahan, as if for confirmation. It was the ghost of a martyr, a meddlesome Muslim soldier who had met his end while fighting the infidels. An arrow had pierced his chest and entered his heart, yet he had kept on fighting relentlessly for 2 more days. On the 3rd morning he had fallen and was buried in this area. Now his soul, disturbed by the hustle and bustle of the construction, was appearing to the laborers, who fretted that the ghost would put a curse on them. Nonsense. Whoever is spreading this story wants to harm Master Sinan. "It's true, Effendi," said Salahaddin. "People have seen it." "Where?" Jahan said, throwing up his hands in exasperation. "Show me." To his surprise, the man pointed with his chin at the scaffolding. "Has the ghost set up home there?" Jahan asked teasingly. But Salahaddin was solemn. "That's where he was seen." During the rest of the afternoon Jahan prowled around the scaffolding, checking the planks, tightening the ropes, making sure it was safe, scowling at every man who so much as threw a glance at him. "You are not paying attention," said Davud, when they were studying the measurements the next day. "I'm sorry." "My mind," said Jahan and gasped. In that moment something had caught his eye, on the raised wooden platform, down along the 3rd tier. A few laborers were working there, one of them carrying a bucket. He watched the man sway on his feet, as if pushed by an invisible hand, then regain his balance. The hairs on the back of Jahan's neck stiffened. In the past, whenever timber was scarce, they had used platforms dangling from abutments above to save wood. But this one rose from the ground and was attached to the walls, supported by struts and trusses. For it to move to and fro, the ropes must have come loose and a part of the edifice must have been hanging free, a part or all. "Are you all right?" asked Davud, following his gaze. A scream of panic shattered the hum of work. They watched a board flip in the air, whirling as though it were a leaf in the wind, and plummet to the ground. Another board hit a mason, landing on his head with a sickening thud. "People! ran left and right as timber and metal rained from above. Qiyamit, asterisk someone wailed. Oxen bellowed in pain, a horse with a broken leg lay on its side, its body twitching, its nostrils flaring. Jahan could not see Chota in the commotion. In the blink of an eye the scaffolding they had proudly put up only weeks before had come tumbling down. The workers on the higher tiers in the middle section suffered the worst falls, along with those down below who had been hit by the planks. Of these, 8 would not survive. Among them was Salahaddin. Sinan and the 4 apprentices approached the Gassel *. May we stay next to you while you wash him? The man hesitated. Then, either because he had recognized the chief royal architect or because he had confused him with a bereaved relative, he said, "That's fine, Effendi." Turning to his apprentices, Sinan asked, "Would any of you like to join me?" Yusuf avoided his gaze, a light blush rising to his cheeks. Nicola, who wasn't a Muslim, said the man might not have wished him to be present at the washing. Davad, suddenly waxen, said he had still not forgotten the corpses he had seen as a child and did not wish to encounter another until the day he died. Being the only one left, Jahan nodded. "I'll come." Lying on cold marble was Salahaddin's naked body. Bruises of various sizes and shades covered the left side of his head and chest where he had been hit by the falling timbers. Even so, Jahan had the strange sensation that the injuries had been painted on rather than etched into Salahaddin's frame, and that if they washed them off, he could, at any moment, show signs of life. "God has built the palace of our body and entrusted to us its key," Sinan said in a voice so quiet that the Gassel, standing behind, bowed his head, assuming he was praying. "The palace of our body." What a peculiar thing to say, Jahan thought. All he saw was a pile of wounded flesh. As if he had read his thoughts, Sinan asked Jahan to come closer. "Man is made in the image of God. At its center there's order, balance. See the circles and the squares. See how proportionately they have been arranged. There are 4 humors: blood, yellow bile, black bile, and phlegm. We work with 4 elements: wood, marble, glass, metal." Jahan and the Gassel exchanged a glance. Jahan knew what the man was thinking, for he'd had similar thoughts himself. He feared that his master, out of sorrow or weariness, had lost his mind. The face is the facade, the eyes are the windows, the mouth is the door that opens into the universe. The legs and the arms are the staircases. Then Sinan poured water from a ewer, and, by drawing circles with his hands, began to wash the body with such tenderness that the Gassel dared not move. That's why when you see a human being, slave or vizier, Mohammedan or heathen, you ought to respect him. Remember, even a beggar owns a palace. Jahan said, with much respect, "Master, I don't see perfection. I see the missing teeth. This crooked bone. All of us, I mean, some are hunchbacked. Others cracks on the surface. But the building is flawless." The Gassel, craning his neck over their shoulders, bowed his head in assent. Perhaps convinced more by the lull of Sinan's voice than by his views. After that, they were silent. They washed the deceased twice, once with warm water, once with tepid. Then they wrapped him head to toe in a milky white shroud, leaving his right hand outside. This they held, gently, and placed on his heart, as though he were saying his goodbyes to this world and his salams to the next. The funeral prayer was led by an imam with a goitra so large that it pressed on his windpipe, making his breath come out in raspy gasps. He said it was of great Consolation that they had died on a construction site. The men had not been leching after women of ill repute or imbibing or gambling or uttering blasphemies. Death had found them in an hour of honest, hard work. When the day of judgment arrived, which it was sure to do, God would take this into account. He said Salahaddin had departed this mortal life while building a bridge for the Sultan. No one dared to say that it was in fact while repairing an aqueduct. In return, in the other world, when it was his turn to cross the bridge of Sirat, thinner than a hair, slimier than 1,000 eels, a pair of angels would assist him. They would hold him by his hands and not let him fall into the flames of hell underneath. The casket was transported to the cemetery amid wailing and keening. Salahaddin's family were poor, so Sinan had paid for his tombstone. The father of the deceased, brought low by age and grief, trudged towards them. Touched and honored that a man like Sinan should attend his son's funeral, he thanked each of them. Salahaddin's brother, meanwhile, kept his distance. It wasn't hard to see he was holding them responsible for his loss, this lad who was no more than 14. One glance at him and Jahan knew they had made themselves yet another enemy. When, after throwing spadefuls of earth on to his brother's coffin, he moved towards the back of the crowd, Jahan followed him. "May God welcome your brother into paradise," Jahan said as soon as he caught up with him. No response. An awkward moment passed between them, as each waited for the other to speak. In the end, it was the lad who broke the silence. "Were you with him when he died?" "I was nearby." "The ghost pushed them." "Did you see it happen?" "Nobody pushed them." "It was an accident," Jahan said nervously. Even he couldn't deny the bizarreness of the incident. "The ghost wants you to stop. There'll be no end to disaster if you disturb him. But your master doesn't care. He has no respect for the dead." "That's not true." "Master is a good man," said Jahan. The boy's face darkened with rage. "Your friend was right. You are befouling a sacred place. What with your hammers and donkeys? You are all condemned to hell." The crowd began to disperse. Amid the mourners inching towards the gate, Jahan noticed Sinan moving listlessly, as though pulled by invisible strings. Against his will. Jahan said weakly, "Don't blame my master." As they left the cemetery, the wind blustered, tufts of dust and dirt rolling in their direction. Later, much later, it would dawn on Jahan that in the commotion, he had not asked Salahaddin's brother who this friend he had talked with was, and why he had uttered premonitions so dire. The next day only half of the laborers turned up for work. "So much for paid workmen," Davud exclaimed. "Had we hired chained galley slaves, none of this would have happened. See where kindness gets us." "Master will find extra hands," Nicholas said. He was right. Determined to complete what he had started, Sinan took on new laborers. It wasn't hard to obtain them. There were many in need of a job in this city. The misery of hunger prevailed over the fear of a saint's curse. For a while, things seemed to improve. The work proceeded without incident. Autumn drew in, the air chilled. Then came the flood. Sweeping down houses, taverns, shrines, and sheds, it gushed through the valleys. Because they had not been able to fully unclog the channels leading to the aqueduct, the waters washed away the scaffolding and crumbled the watercourse as if it had been a wafer. The flood had caught them unprepared. No one was injured. But they lost weeks of work and materials of value. The disaster gave credence to the gossip-mongers' rumors, and even those who had previously been unsure now became convinced that Sinan and his Apprentices were accursed. Their spirits sank. Until this point their master had overcome every obstacle, no matter how great or daunting. Yet this was different. How could Sinan possibly defeat a ghost? The renovation work stopped. Hard as Sinan tried, he could not convince a single soul to keep on working. The laborers accused the chief royal architect of putting them in danger in order to win the Sultan's favor. Who needed water when the water was jinxed? The aqueducts dated from the days of the infidels. Why repair them if not to spread idolatry? Jahan was surprised to hear they had already forgotten about the ghost of the Muslim martyr. They had found new fears to cling to, and cling they did. Silent and compliant on the surface, they whispered malicious gossip as soon as the apprentices turned their backs. After a week of the Sinan appeared with a small, wiry visitor by his side. The two of them climbed up onto the newly built scaffolding. Workmen. Foreman. We are fortunate to have a respectable Hajjah * with us. Sinan extended his hand to the stranger. The man took a step forward, ashen and drawn, unused to heights. Closing his eyes, he chanted verses from the Quran. He was called the Nightingale Hajjah, they learned. Born in Bosnia, he could commune with God in 7 languages and knew the ways of many creeds and sects. There was something in the voice of this man, who otherwise looked very ordinary, that enchanted the laborers. He told them to move on and never speak evil of others, for if Shaitan could fly so high, it was thanks to 2 wings: sloth and slander. The Hajjah came every day, stood with them from dawn to dusk, dust in his hair, mud on his shoes. He sprinkled blessed water and uttered the prayer of Sevzan, which he said the Archangel Gabriel had revealed when the Prophet Mohammed was afraid and in need of protection, for prophets, just like common men, could be frightened of the dangers of this world, and he sanctified the aqueducts, calming the fears of Jews, Christians, and Muslims alike. Then he concluded, "It's clean now. This site is as pure as your mother's milk. Go back to work." So they did. Little by little, they finished the renovation so perfectly that even those who hated Sinan more than any soul on earth could not raise objections. Sultan Sulayman was pleased. He honored his architect with gifts and praises, calling him Al-Insan al-Kamil *. It was after this incident that Jahan understood his master's secret resided not in his toughness, for he was not tough, nor in his indestructibility, for he was not indestructible, but in his ability to adapt to change and calamity, and to rebuild himself, again and again, out of the ruins. While Jahan was made of wood, and Davud of metal, and Nicola of stone, and Yusuf of glass, Sinan was made of flowing water. When anything blocked his course, he would flow under, around, above it, however he found his way through the cracks, and kept flowing forward. What an awful night it was! Chota was in pain. Roaring, bellowing, growling till the first light of the day, he swayed his trunk this way and that, exhausted. Such was his discomfort that Jahan had to sleep next to him, if sleep he could. 1. Peek into the animal's mouth and he saw the reason for his torment. The molar at the back of his left lower jaw was a nasty black color and the gum had become swollen with pus. Jahan recalled how the summer before he had had a terrible toothache himself, and the barber who shaved the overseer of the royal stables had taken pity on him. Amid wailing and groaning, the man had pulled and pulled, ending Jahan's suffering. Even so, Jahan could not think of a single soul in Istanbul brave enough to remove an elephant's molar. "What's the matter? Taras asked as soon as he entered the stable and saw his face. A head on a pike looks happier than you. It's Chota. His tooth is killing him. If we were only in the taiga, said Taras with a sigh. I know of a shrub that can mend him in an instant. Grandma is fond of it? Jahan gaped at him in astonishment. Is your granny still alive? She's one of the damned, said Taras. Seeing Jahan's surprise he added. Drilly, no worse curse than to bury all your loved ones and still keep breathing. Years later Jahan would remember this moment, but now the words whizzed by him like a current of air. Get garlic, lots, fennel, oil of clove, a tad of anise, no more. Mix them. Jahan obtained the ingredients from the kitchen and pounded them in a mortar until they turned into a gooey, green paste. When he showed him the concoction, Taras was pleased. Now rub it on the beast's gums. This will give him comfort. For now, the tooth needs to be pulled out. Jahan rushed back to the barn. The elephant resisted his attempts with such fierceness he could apply only half the paste, and he wasn't sure he had swabbed the right molar anyway. Chota's mouth reeked of an unpleasant odor. He had not been able to eat anything, and hunger, as always, made his blood boil. Stitching together two mufflers, Jahan placed the remaining ointment inside and tied it around the animal's head, against the inflamed skin. Chota looked so funny he would have laughed had the poor thing not been in such agony. Out on the streets, Jahan searched for an itinerant tooth drawer or barber. The first man he asked burst out laughing upon learning the identity of the patient. The next was a fellow with such a menacing aspect that Jahan did not dare to take him to the menagerie. He was about to give up when he recalled the one soul in this city who knew everything about everything, Simeon the bookseller. The quarter around the Galata Tower was swarming with people. Merchants walked in tandem with peddlers, emissaries and dragomen moved aside to let ox carts pass, an ambassador in a Tataravan breezed along, carried by black slaves. Dogs roamed in packs. He saw men going to classes at the yeshiva, the elderly chatting in corners, a woman pulling her son by the hand. Words in Spanish, French and Arabic swirled in the wind. Rounding a corner, thinking of Chota, he was rushing when he stopped in his tracks. Ahead of him, merely a few steps away from Simeon's house, was the traveler he had drunk with at the roadside inn. Next to him was Yusuf, the mute apprentice, his eyes on the ground. The man said something, after which Yusuf nodded and walked away. In a burst of memory, Jahan remembered how they had been robbed on the way back from Rome. Suddenly, he suspected that the man in front of his eyes had had something to do with it. Hey, Tommaso. The Italian turned round. His eyes grew small as he caught sight of Jahan. Sprinting fast as an arrow, he disappeared into the crowd. Jahan gave chase for a while, though it was clear he would not be able to catch him. Dispirited, he strode back, knocked on Simeon's door. You all right? The bookseller asked. Was Yusuf here a moment ago? With the blonde man. What blonde man? I haven't seen Yusuf in weeks. Never mind, Jahan said with a sigh. I need your help. Good timing, a ship's arrived. There are new books from Spain. I'll look at them later. I need to help the elephant first. When Jahan told him his problem, Simeon's mouth twisted into a grimace. I'm a man of ideas, never operated on an animal. Do you know of anyone? None better than you. Tell you what, I'll see if there's anything in one of the books. Then you can do it yourself. Fine, said Jahan weakly. You'll need to sedate him. Get lots of boza. Better yet, sleeping draught. Simeon said that, in the past, physicians had used hemlock, which had killed many a mortal and saved a few. Nowadays they preferred nightshade and mandragora, the latter a plant that unleashed an awful shriek when torn out of the soil. But the best was opium. Galen recommended it for jaundice, dropsy, leprosy, headache, coughs and melancholy. For a man Jahan's age and size, 2 spoonfuls was the right amount. Since an elephant weighed as much as a mountain and was as tall as a tree. Simeon's eyebrows arched as he made a calculation. You are going to need a cask. Where am I going to find that? Simeon said, the chief white eunuch. There's no miracle he cannot perform. Jahan returned to the palace with a book under his arm and misgivings in his head. Nobody messed with Carnation Camel Aga. He hadn't forgotten the scolding he had received from him when he had first arrived. Even so, mustering courage, Jahan went to see him. To his surprise, the man was agreeable, kind. Even a cask of opium was provided at a stroke. Jahan did not inquire how it was acquired. Years in the palace had instilled in him the code of silence. 2 tamers hoisted up Chota's upper jaw, 2 others held down his lower one. The elephant, in pain and tired, did not put up much of a fight. For good measure, with the help of a funnel, they poured a jug of mulled red wine into his listless mouth. Little by little, Chota's breathing slackened off, his face melted like wax, his eyes glazed over. His legs gave way under his enormous weight and he tumbled down. They tied him with hawsers and chains and ropes, in case he woke up and attacked them in a fit of delirium. In this state Jahan started to operate on him. He began with a chisel, quickly moved to a hammer. Dara the giraffe tamer, Cato the crocodile tamer and Olef the lion tamer took turns pounding, thumping, clouting, then pulling, yanking, wrenching. After what felt like an eternity, Jahan rooted out a tooth, like the fang of a giant snake from a tail. A Medda would tell in a coffee house somewhere. Give it to me, ordered the chief white eunuch, his eyes glinting. Jahan now grasped why the man had been so nice to him from the start. Having appropriated the cabinet of curiosities that had once belonged to Hurrem Sultana, he wanted to add Chota's tooth to it. Jahan felt a shudder as he wondered where he kept this cabinet and what else it might contain. Upon learning that Rustem Pasha had passed away, Jahan felt many things at once, but sorrow wasn't among them. Princess Miramah's husband, the father of her 3 children, the royal favorite who had touched her every night. The Devshirm who had risen too fast, the great Grand Vizier, much respected and much feared. The man who had sent Jahan to the dungeon and expected him to kiss his hand upon release, had gone the way of all flesh. He had been suffering from dropsy for a while, that much Jahan knew. For no matter how he had tried to keep the man away from his thoughts, every passing day Jahan had heard something new about him and hated him more. A month later Miramah summoned Sinan, sending word that he should bring along his Indian apprentice. Chief Royal Architect, I want you to build an exquisite mosque for my late lamented spouse, may heaven be his abode. She was wearing somber colors, befitting a widow. Jahan waited behind his master, his hands clasped, his gaze fixed on the carpet, and he thought to himself he would be in charge of this mosque and put a sign in it, somewhere, subtle but obvious to the knowing eye. He would etch his dislike of Rustem Pasha into the very monument dedicated to him. If it were a sin to think such things, he was sinful, for sure. Unaware of his thoughts, Miramah kept talking. There was no need to fret about the sums, as she would cover all the costs. She demanded a spacious courtyard and a row of vaulted shops to provide revenue for the mosque. She was keen to make generous use of the best Iznik tiles, sage green, sapphire blue, and a red as dark as yesterday's blood. "It shall be as you wish, your highness," said Sinan. "I want it to be glorious," said Mimar. "Worthy of my late husband's noble name." Jahan sighed inwardly. Resentment coiled inside him like a serpent. He lamented, almost against his will, having accompanied his master into this house of riches. But then, as if she had noticed his discomfort, Mimar turned to him. "I haven't seen the elephant in a while. How is the beast doing?" "Chota missed you, your highness," said Jahan quietly. She inspected him, taking in the marks of time. "How can you tell?" "Many a day I found him waiting with his eyes fixed on the path your highness had graced." Mimar raised her hand, as if to touch the air between them. "Well, tell Chota that I was away, trapped in another life, but I shall come back and visit him, for I have never known a white elephant like him. He will be happy to hear this, your highness. Tell him that none of this was in my hands." Jahan's eyes slid to the sky. A kite hovered above, soaring on an updraft. "Beautiful and free," he said. "I am sure he understands, your highness. And I am sure he still awaits your return. Elephants never forget." She nodded slowly. "You may go now. May God guide you." As the master and the apprentice were taking their leave, Mimar murmured, "You said elephants never forget. What about elephant tamers?" Jahan paled. He felt the gaze of his master, who was startled by the informality of the conversation he had just heard. But for once he didn't want to hide. He didn't want to pretend. Bowing his head, he said, "Neither do they, your highness. Neither do they. Istanbul, the seat of the throne, weary of fires and earthquakes though it was, bulged at the seams. A honeysuckle of a city, it drew from near and far people of every kind, bustling, seeking, yearning. There were far too many souls under the same sky, outnumbering the stars at which they gazed, Muslims, Christians, Jews, believers and heretics of each faith, talking to God all at once, their pleas and prayers for succor and good fortune carried on the wind, mingling with the cries of seagulls. Jahan wondered how the Almighty could hear any of them over the commotion. Towards the end of the summer, the Shaykh al-Islam, Abu Su'ud Effendi, railed against Sinan. He declared that the marble plagues the architect had moved from the Hagia Sophia during a reconstruction were damned, and had brought one calamity after another upon the Istanbulites. In the end, not knowing where to place the cursed stones of the old church, Sinan and the apprentices used them in the tomb of Hurrem Sultana, trusting she wouldn't mind. In 1566, the first day of May it was, war was waged to conquer the fortress of Zajitvar, and the elephant's services were required. Miserable as he was to hear this, Jahan complied. He might have been training as Sinan's apprentice, but he was, and would remain so long as Chota was alive, the Sultan's mahout. They reached Belgrade in June. The Danube River ran as far as the eye could see, rowdy, alluring, grand. Sultan Suleiman, who up to then had been riding in front of them, slowed down his horse, a sorrel mare, to a trot. Little did Jahan know that this was because the Sultan's gout had become so painful that he had difficulty keeping his seat on the mount. His Grand Vizier, Sokolo, an astute man with a measured voice and an earnest expression, a devsherm from a Bosnian village called Hawk's Nest, had considered having him carried in a litter but ultimately rejected the idea. Such a move would only dishearten the troops, who would rather see tadpoles raining from the sky than their commander frail and fading. That was when a solution was found. Chota Jahan was instructed to ready the elephant for carrying the Lord of East and West. Make sure your animal knows who's riding him, he had been forewarned. The next morning Jahan saw the Sultan up close for the first time in several years. His skin, drained of color, reminded him of the cold ashes that gathered in a fireplace, the flames long gone. His high forehead, which he had passed on to Miramah, was lined with wrinkles, and obscure calligraphy inked by time. Bowing low, Jahan kissed the hem of his kaftan, a robe of no fine cloth, since Sulayman still shunned opulence. His guards helped him up into the howdah. Once he was settled, Jahan took his seat on Chota's neck. In this manner, they carried on. They arrived at Zajidvar on the 5th day of August. It was a sweltering afternoon, the fields flecked with dandelions. They set up camp and brought over the siege cannons, pulled by dozens of oxen. Then they erected the Sultan's tent, with its 7 white horsetails, atop a hill from where the sovereign could gaze at the fortress they had sworn to capture. Inside the castle, the Count Nikola Subik-Zierensky was in command. His people had hung enormous cloths, the color of blood, from the ramparts. What does that mean? Jahan asked a foot soldier. It means they'll not come out of that damn castle. They'd rather die. Stubborn and staunch, the Count and his soldiers defended their citadel. Days turned into weeks. A month passed. The heat became unbearable. For food, they had roasted millet, nuts, dried meat, and a piece of hard mare's milk cheese each. The flocks of sheep and goats that they had brought from Istanbul were waiting, ready to be slaughtered. How the enemy withstood the hunger and their diminishing numbers, Jahan could not say. The Sultan's army would charge, the fortress would hold out. Many fell on both sides, more from the Ottoman than from the enemy lines. But where the defenders had hundreds, the Ottomans had thousands. They buried their dead in pits deeper than the deepest wells and prepared themselves for another charge. Time and again they sent emissaries, asking the Count to surrender, promising safety should he do so. Sultan Sulayman offered to let him become the ruler of Croatia under Ottoman direction. Every messenger returned with the same answer: they would fight. The sounds of the Ottoman cannonades echoed through the rolling hills. The enemy's resistance was unshakable. The holes in the defenses opened during the day were repaired at night by men, women, and children. They used everything. They had to fortify the walls: timber, fabric, carpets. Nothing was spared. Not even an exquisite silk tapestry that must have belonged to a wealthy family. Water nymphs danced on its surface, holding lyres, their hair shimmering like moonlight on dark waves. Jahan could not take his eyes off it. Nor could the Janissaries. There was something enchanting in the image of this lustrous paradise, its brightness and softness so alluring that the commanders, suspecting sorcery, ordered the tapestry to be bombarded. They attacked that part of the wall ceaselessly, until all the lustrous colors disappeared into a dull rag of soot and slag. One clear afternoon in September, Jahan was riding Chota, bringing the Sultan back to his tent, when they heard a blast that would ring in their ears for days on end. The ground shook, billows of smoke rose above the clouds. The elephant jerked, almost throwing them down. Jahan yelled orders at Chota, trying to soothe him while he gaped at the pitch-dark sky. Mahout, what's going on? The Sultan demanded from where he lay on cushions inside the howdah. My lord, they have blown up their arsenal, and themselves. What did you say? The Sultan sat up, leaning forward for a better look. So they have, he murmured. So they have. For a long, horrified moment the sovereign and the mahout watched the blaze. Chota swung his trunk and flapped his ears in a frenzy. Oblivious to the animals. Unease, the Sultan ordered, go near. I want to see. Jahan obeyed, hoping that, midway, the elephant would not become overwrought. But when they reached the scene it would be he who would be shaken. The ground was strewn with shattered weapons and severed limbs. It was impossible to say which were the enemies and which were theirs. Jahan's breath came in gasps as his gorge rose. Bile filled his mouth and nearly caused him to vomit. He hid his face with his hands. Don't cry, the Sultan said. Pray. Ashamed of his weakness, Jahan straightened his shoulders. I shall pray for our soldiers, my lord. No, he said. Pray for them all. There's no difference anymore. This man who had, throughout the 46 years of his rule, relentlessly fought one war after another, who had ordered his brightest Grand Vizier and perhaps his only friend to be killed, who had watched his eldest son being strangled, caused another son to die of sorrow and arranged for a third to be murdered far away in Iran, who had made himself the strongest of all the Ottoman sultans, this man had just said, in a field of dandelions and death, that in the end there was no difference between the soldier inside and the soldier outside the enemy stronghold, the Christian and the Muslim, leaving Jahan with a riddle that he would not solve for many years to come. The next morning, the smell of burning flesh still canopied the battlefield, a stench so thick no wind could carry it away. Jahan felt as if the smell had lodged in the back of his throat, making it hard to breathe, let alone swallow. Still, like any other day, he made Chota ready for the sovereign, and they waited in front of his tent. Yet it was Sokalu who walked out after a while, saying, in a whisper, that he wished to have a word with the mahout. By now, Jahan had lived in the seraglio for long enough to know that if a Grand Vizier wished to speak with a common servant, something terrible must have happened. Or was about to. Jahan followed him, his heart in his mouth. Inside the Sultan's tent, though there was plenty of daylight, a lamp glowed dimly in one corner. Across from it, on a velvet sofa, was the Sultan, lying perfectly still. Listen, son, said the Vizier. What you see, no one knows. Do you understand? Is he? Jahan faltered. That's right, sadly. Our Sultan has passed away, may he dwell in paradise. We will mourn later. You and I have an important duty. Not knowing where to look, Jahan stared, wide-eyed with woe, at his feet. Sultan Suleiman, aged 72, had not lived long enough to glory in their triumph. It's essential that we hide the truth from the army. Sokalu spoke carefully. Haltingly, a man who believed that words, like money, should be used sparingly. Our Sultan will sit on the elephant as if it were any other day. You shall take him around. Jahan winced as it dawned on him that he would have to place a corpse on Chota. He asked, what if somebody wants to speak to the Sultan? Make sure the elephant does not go near anyone. If the Janissaries see the Sultan from afar, that'll be enough. They don't need to hear his voice. All they need to know is that he's alive. Suddenly they heard footsteps. The guards were bringing someone in. Sokalu, having ensured only the most trustworthy could pass through the threshold, craned his head to check who was entering. It was a short, bull-necked Tatar. Oh, it's you. Come forward. The Grand Vizier took out a scroll from his robe, kissed it and put it on his forehead. "Take this to Prince Selim." The man bowed low. "Be fast as the wind. Do not stop anywhere on the way. Eat mounted. Don't sleep. Don't waste time. The fate of the empire depends upon you." Jahan wondered how long it would take to gallop from Zajidvar to Kudahaya, where the prince was serving as governor. It was not enough that the news of his father's death should reach him without delay, he, too, had to arrive at Istanbul in time. An empty throne was an ominous sign. Anything could happen in the gap between the father's death and the son's ascension to the throne. So Khalid brought out a Quran from a mother-of-pearl box. "I need you to swear on the holy book. Both of you." They did as told. Nevertheless, the Grand Vizier didn't seem satisfied. He inquired where they were from. "Hindustan," Jahan said. "Kazan," the messenger replied. So Kala took out a dagger, gilded and bejeweled. "Give me your hands." He made a cut on the messenger's forefinger, then on Jahan's. Blood trickled from their hands onto the sheath of the dagger. "If one of you gives the secret away, I shall kill you both." Jahan did not understand why his life should depend on a stranger, and the messenger must have felt the same way, for he turned to him with a frown. Still, neither dared to protest. So Kala gave them 2 silk handkerchiefs to wrap around their fingers. "Now go, my son," he said to the messenger, "may Allah guide you." Jahan took a last look at the man whose loyalty he now counted on. They nodded at one another in silent farewell. Jahan would not know that years later it was this same messenger who would bring Master Sinan to the palace on the night when Sultan Sulayman's grandson killed his 5 brothers to secure the throne. No sooner had the messenger left than the physician came in. An ex-converso from Salamanca who had fully returned to his religion. He spoke Ottoman with a lilting accent. He, too, was sworn to secrecy, though without a holy script, since the 5 books of Moses were not present, and, for some reason, his finger was spared. "Can he help me?" the physician asked, nodding towards Jahan. So Kala, his back now turned to them, was absorbed in forging the Sultan's signature, sending out letters and orders in the sovereign's name. He waved dismissively, saying over his shoulder, "Go help." The physician opened a jar that filled the tent with a pungent smell. A mixture of myrrh, cassia, and other spices. They undressed the Sultan and anointed his entire body. What Jahan saw next he would not be able to tell anyone, no matter how badly he might want to. It would penetrate his dreams, time and again. The chief physician cut open the left side of the Sultan's chest and pulled out the heart. It resembled a red bird in his palms, and, even though it lay motionless, for a second Jahan feared it was still beating. Holding it with both hands, the physician placed it on a silver basin. Then he sewed the wound with 12 perfect stitches. Jahan glanced up at the man in horror. "Effendi, why did we do this? The heart is the center of our very being. It was our Sultan's last wish. Should he die here, he wanted his heart to be buried on the battleground." Choosing the best kaftan they could find in the trunks, they dressed the corpse. Finally, they combed his beard, lined his eyes with soot and colored his cheeks with a rosy powder. When they were done, Sultan Sulayman looked healthier than he had while he was alive. "Take off that robe," so Kalu remarked as soon as he saw what they had done. "Too glamorous. He wouldn't wear that." They settled on a plain robe and readied the corpse. At dusk, 3 elite guards, having finished inspecting the camp, arrived to report that all was quiet. With their help the elephant was brought to the entrance. Chota was anxious, sensing something was wrong. "What's the matter?" So Kalu asked, irritated. "My lord, give me time with the beast, I beg." Jahan spoke sweetly to Chota, telling him that he would be carrying a dead man. Just for a few days, he assured him. After much cajoling and many apples, the animal calmed down, allowing them to place the Sultan into the howdah. Jahan took his usual place on the elephant's neck and rode on, his eyes fixed on the circling vultures in the distance. When he saw a few of them descend upon the bodies strewn about far down below, he had to turn away. 20,000 men were lost during the siege of Sajidvar. On the way back, they learned that Prince Salim had made it to the city. The messenger had succeeded. So Kala was immensely relieved. There being no more need to pretend, he ordered his guards to reveal the truth. The Sultan's body was brought down from the howdah and placed in a litter, which was then pulled by 2 white stallions. In this way they reached the capital. The people of Istanbul were waiting for them. Thousands had gathered on both sides of the road, tearing their hair and their garments, beating their chests. Jahan saw fearless warriors break into tears, men sob like boys. On the heels of the father's burial came the son's enthronement. Salim wanted the people to celebrate as they had never done before. Earthquakes, diseases, death, calamities had fallen so thick and fast that there had not been any joy left, much less hope. They had had enough of mourning. Now it was time to rejoice. The ulama were appalled. Even so, Kala was frightened of their reaction. It was his advisor Faridun Beg who convinced him that it was fine to let the multitude have a bit of fun. He said, "Can a body be constipated all the time? The world needs to empty its bowels. Let them make merry, my vizier." On the day Salim ascended the throne, Chota was arrayed in a magnificent headdress and a silver mantle decorated with gems. The elephant led the royal procession through the streets of Istanbul. People waved, cheered, sang loudly. And, once again, Jahan could not believe how suddenly the public mood changed from sorrow to rejoicing, how quickly their river of tears ran dry. If they moved between gloom and glee with such ease, did this mean they could pass from love to hatred just as effortlessly? Once the new Sultan had been enthroned, Chota and Jahan went back to work on the construction sites. In the mornings they would leave the menagerie, always through the same path. In the evenings they would return, tired and thirsty, smelling of dust and mud. At or about this time Master Sinan started to build a bridge over the bar that connected the Bayuk Sekmes lake to the sea, long, arched and graceful. On a night in December, having finished the bulk of the construction, they were returning to the city, the master and the 3 apprentices in a carriage. Jahan ahead of them, riding Chota. As soon as they turned round a bend they heard a noise, far off from the city, and somewhere in the midst of it a scream, sharp and blood-curdling. When Jahan lifted his head skywards he saw a cascade of orange, yellow and red, the colors so bright they hurt his eyes. He shouted, "Fire!" The carriage came to a stop and they got out. Sinan looked devastated. He said, "We ought to go to help. Why don't we go with Chota?" Jahan said, "It'll be faster." They all climbed up into the howdah while Jahan planted himself on the elephant's neck. They trudged along the streets, following the shouts that pierced the air like splintered glass. As they went, the wind blew stronger, hotter, scattering the firestorm from one wooden house to the next. Jahan blinked repeatedly, dazzled as much by the glow as by the commotion. The flames licked the night sky in swirls of color so vivid that it felt almost solid. Every now and then a blaze went up, trees glaring like Murano chandeliers. Each corner they turned displayed a sight more harrowing than the previous one. Animals trotted around, lost, dazed. Families tried to save what little they had, men lugging baskets and barrels, women pale with fright, babies crying their hearts out. Children, only they, remained dauntless, scampering about as if in the midst of a game the grown ups had invented for them to play. In front of their eyes entire neighborhoods went up in smoke. Rooms in which mothers had given birth, where circumcisions were celebrated, life was conceived and the sickly drew their last breaths, these places with the memories they held turned to cinders. Nothing remained except a lingering warmth and strewn about on the ground, clothes, shoes, trifles, a piece of a brick that was once a wall. They came to a halt at a thoroughfare where the fire had hit the worst. Sinan, taken aback, asked to be brought down. As the chief royal architect he had worked hard to prevent this calamity, having the streets paved, checking the buildings. All for naught. There were janissaries idling, humping cases, talking to people, but with leaden steps, almost reluctant. Sinan marched up to one of them, a man sitting on a piece of timber, gazing around dully. "Why aren't you doing something?" The janissary, not expecting to be questioned and not recognizing the architect, snapped out of his reverie. "What? Why are you not helping the people?" "I am," said the man morosely. Another janissary edged nearer. He said they had not been quenching the flames because they were waiting to hear from their aga, who was sick in bed. At this Sinan's face darkened. "What orders do you need to hear? How can you hold off when the city is in flames?" While Sinan was talking with the janissaries, the mahout, and the elephant, distracted by a sound, veered into a side street. Further down the road Jahan saw two women screaming at each other, beside themselves. From neighbors he learned they were the wives of a merchant who was away traveling. When the fire broke out, the women had run out of the house, grabbing their children, each assuming that the other had snatched the newborn baby. Jahan looked at the burning building and at the crying women. "You wait for me here. I'm going in," he said to Chota. He wouldn't dream of taking the elephant with him, knowing how scared he was of the flames. Slowly, Jahan made his way towards the smoldering house. He took every step with the utmost care, listening out for the slightest sound. Once he crossed the threshold, the flames assaulted him from all sides. The upper story above the front rooms had collapsed, but the building was still intact at the back. Jahan saw a brass candle holder and snatched it out of habit, even though it was of little worth. A few steps ahead he got luckier, an empty inkpot of gold and emerald. Coughing and rasping, Jahan fumbled through curtains of smoke, his eyes watering so much he could barely see where he was going. He dodged a burning timber that fell right down in front of him. The wood hit his shoulder, knocking him down. There was no way he could go any further. Suddenly, a soft coil of flesh grabbed him by the waist and lifted him up. "Chota! How did you get here?" Jahan exclaimed. In lieu of a response, the elephant led him towards the depths of the house, or what was left of it. Chota moved his ears as though catching an imperceptible sound. The animal's sensitive feet must have been burning, but the mahout would not think of that until later. Jahan could not open his mouth for fear of swallowing more smoke. Every breath hurt. Taking off his jacket, he wrapped it around his face. Chota shoved him from behind, gently but firmly. Hedged in by flames, Jahan lurched forward into the second room, then steadied himself. The elephant waited behind him. There it was, the cradle. Its gauzy tulle covering must have helped the baby to breathe. Jahan grabbed the bundle, without checking whether the child was alive. With one hand the baby, clinging to life, clutched at Jahan. It had cried so much its voice was gone, its rosebud mouth was closed. Yet its strength was surprising, and it must have been contagious, too, for both Chota and Jahan were calmer now. By the time Chota and Jahan emerged, the number of people watching on the street had tripled. Sinan and the apprentices, too, were there, having heard the story of the beast that had plodded into a burning house. The mother of the baby dashed towards them and plucked the baby away from Jahan. Then she began praying, laughing, thanking, crying, trying to kiss Jahan's hand, Chota's skin, all at once, with no fear of being trampled by the elephant. Jahan tottered towards Sinan, who was greeting him with open arms. "I am furious at you," he said, "but proud, son, so proud." The apprentices embraced him. Even so, Jahan could feel a coldness exuding from them. He had outshone them, and this they hadn't liked. It turned out the chief Janissary Aga had really been ill. Yet that was not the reason why he had delayed sending instructions to the soldiers. The army, demanding an increase in their pay, had seen the fire as an opportunity to prove how essential they were. As the Grand Vizier had been slow in granting the rise, the Aga had been slow in giving the command to his Janissaries to put out the flames. The Mahout and the elephant headed to the master's home, smothered in soot and reeking of cinders. Jahan wrapped Chota's feet. 2 of his nails were broken, bleeding. He had patches of burned skin all over. The scars from that night would remain and never heal. Later on, from Sinan's garden, Jahan stood gazing at the city below, wraiths of smoke whirling here and there. At dawn there were no birds chirping, no hearths crackling, no seagulls swooping, everything had plunged into silence. It had become nippy, the cold felt strange following the heat of the night. After the fire died out, the extent of the devastation was clear. With the exception of the Jewish quarter, which was built of stone, street after street had been razed. "The fire was our teacher," Sinan said when they all gathered again. "He taught us a lesson." That same week Sinan went to the palace and obtained the permissions that he needed. Sleeping little, he drew plans. Streets would be enlarged by half a cubit on each side. There would be no house taller than 2 stories. More brick and stone, instead of wood, would be used, he decided. No sooner were the new rules introduced, however, than people began to defy them. The fire had been a teacher, true. But Istanbul, where forgetting was easier than remembering, never learned its lesson. One evening Sangram came to see Jahan with a bowl of sutlach, just as he had done so many moons ago. He was very old and frail, and every now and then he shook his head uncontrollably, as if arguing with some invisible companion. Jahan took the treat, thanking him. As he watched him eat, Sangram asked, "Did you hear what Captain Crazyhead has done this time?" Jahan almost dropped his spoon. "What?" "Captain Gareth's fleet had run into an armada. In the ensuing combat the seaman bit the hand that had fed him all these years and turned traitor. Starting on the side of the Ottomans, he had ended toasting the Pope. Knowing he would be gutted alive if caught, he had fled the Ottoman territory. He could not return to Istanbul. Not that he minded. Having been given sanctuary by the papacy, he was quite content with his new banner, hunting for Ottoman sailors. When Jahan heard this he was dumbstruck, flooded with disturbing memories. Captain Gareth was the sole reason he had ended up in the royal menagerie. It had been the man's plan to disguise him as an animal tamer and place him a stone's throw away from the riches in the seraglio. A plan that had worked seamlessly once the sailors in his command had got rid of the real Mahout. Hurled into cold waters, just like that. Never liked the chap's wits, the captain had said by way of explanation, though Jahan never understood how he could have disliked this man, who spoke not a word of Turkish or English and stared at the waves all day long. Inside the hold they carried merchandise from Hindustan, and a white elephant on the brink of death. Jahan was only a cabin boy, escaping his stepfather. He was a mere youngster from a town in Anatolia. What did he know about elephants? As he stood there, remembering all of this, another thought occurred to Jahan. Why was Sangram suddenly telling him about Captain Gareth? So you knew, Jahan whispered. How could I not? Sangram said. You told me you were from Hindustan. You spoke not a word of any of our languages and the stories you told made no sense. Why didn't you inform on me? You could have told everyone, this boy is an impostor, he is lying. Sangram smiled. I was going to, but then I changed my mind. I didn't want you to suffer. You seemed like you'd had your share of hardships, why bring more pain? Jahan stood up, kissed the man's bony hand. You were only a lad, now look at you, Sangram said, overwhelmed with tenderness. Jahan bit his lip. How bizarre it was. While he had been running after things that were never going to happen and resenting life for the gifts it had denied him, there had been people supporting him without drawing attention to themselves. They had given and expected nothing in return. Sultan Selim was determined to enjoy, revive, and expand the menagerie. Unlike his father, who had barely acknowledged the existence of his animal subjects, the new sovereign took an interest in their lives. He often visited the wild beasts. Sometimes on his own, mostly in the company of his courtiers. In particular, he was enthralled by the big cats, tigers, cheetahs, and lions, and, for a reason unbeknown to anyone, had taken a shine to the ostrich. The apes aroused his curiosity with their arcane sounds and gestures. Yet it was Chota he loved best. He was fond of rides atop the elephant. To this end he had ordered a larger howdah with a foldable ladder to be supplied. Chota had been presented with a new headdress, bright turquoise, lined with golden tassels and adorned with peacock feathers. To Jahan's dismay there was an equally and ridiculously showy outfit for him, a shimmering silvery jerkin with embroidered blue tulips, and a white turban. The Sultan had a penchant for ornateness, both in himself and in those around him. He liked spending time with dwarves, mutes, buffoons, preferring their company to that of his viziers and advisers with their dreary talk. A poet and an archer, Selim was a sad, troubled man, with a neck so short as to be almost non-existent, a florid complexion and shoulders rounded as though crushed under an invisible weight. He became Sultan at the age of 42, no longer in his springtime. All his life he had been waiting, praying and plotting for the Ottoman throne, yet when the moment came, he was not ready. Jahan thought of him as a flickering candlelight, nervous, erratic, awaiting the wind that would one day put him out. His brother Bayezid, his biggest rival, had been executed in Iran, leaving Selim the sole heir. That must have gratified him, one would expect. Instead, it had turned him fretful. If princes could be killed so easily, and without any remorse or recriminations, Whom could he trust in this world? He drank amply. He ate voraciously. He slept with the prettiest women. He went hunting, deer, duck, partridge, wild boar. Nothing quenched his thirst. One glance at his dress was enough to see the difference between him and his father. In his passion for opulence he adorned himself with rare gems, wore refined brocade, heady perfumes. He lined his eyes with kohl, which gave his gaze a hardness that didn't quite match his personality. That his turbans, decorated with plumes in garish colors, were taller than Sultan Sulayman's did not escape anyone's notice. His many women had many children. But there was one concubine who surpassed all others and became his wife, Nurbanu the Venetian, the enchantress. The name her mother had given her was Cecilia. She said she came from a family of high standing and would have lived as a noblewoman had she not been taken as a slave by the corsairs at the age of 12. Unfriendly mouths completed the parts of the story she left out, that though fathered by a patrician, she was born out of wedlock. Nurbanu never gave up sending letters to her relatives in Corfu and Venice. She also wrote to the Bailo, the Doge, the Senate. In response she not only received a round of correspondence but also gifts. Like Selim himself, Nurbanu cherished splendor. Recently, upon her request, she had been sent a pair of lapdogs from Venice, with clipped, creamy coats that never left her side. Funny creatures they were, barking at every moving thing, unmindful of their size. Before each meal their food was tried by a taster, in case some wicked soul attempted to poison them. There were quite a few who would have liked to do so. At nights, around the fireplace, the tamers talked about her, exchanging rumors and tall tales. The code that required everyone to be silent was still observed, but not as strictly as before. Though they were careful with their choice of words and used a secret tongue, they gossiped to their heart's content. Other things changed, too. From the courtyard of the eunuchs to the tower of the chief physician, from the chambers of the princes to the dormitories of the Zuluflu Baltasiler, the halberdiers of the tresses, the seraglio rang with sound. Every noise that had been suppressed during the reign of Sulayman was now set free, eddying round the corridors. On days when the weather was balmy the Sultan delighted in boating with his companions, eating and drinking as they glided round the Golden Horn, sucking on musk lozenges to sweeten their breath. Selim believed that as long as his Grand Vizier Sokalu held the reins the empire would run just fine. Although he was not capable of absorbing the intricacies of the state, there was a part of him that would rather have remained a poet, or an itinerant bard, had he not been confined to the throne. The ulama hated his ways and accused him of being a sinner. The Janissaries berated him for not leading the army from battlefield to battlefield. The people compared him with his father, finding him weak and cursing the ghost of Hurrem, which still roamed the marble halls, for giving birth to no better. Selim placated them, making endowments, distributing riches, just so they would leave him alone. Thanks to his generosity, the nasty things that were said about him were washed away like writing on wet sand, only to be written all over again a short time afterwards. Among Selim's closest courtiers were poets, elegists, and musicians. There was a poetess called Hubai Hatun. She could recite for hours, her eyes closed, her voice rising and falling like a seagull in the gust. There were balladeers who knew songs from all corners of the empire and could sing in a dozen languages, sending their audience from bliss to despair, from despair to bliss. There was a painter who, when he got a bit tipsy, said someday he would use his own blood for the color red. Jahan knew them all. They strolled through the rose gardens in their easygoing fashion, after which they would stop by the menagerie, watching and feeding the animals. They were a raucous bunch that loved to feast and roister as much as their patron did. Their visits were sudden, random. It could be at any hour of the afternoon or the evening. One Thursday, in the dead of night, the tamers woke up to the sound of music and laughter. They blinked at each other through sleepy eyes, struggling to fathom what was going on. "Where are the damn servants?" a voice boomed in the dark. Donning their garments, they rushed out, lined up. The Sultan and 3 guests were there, sprightly and, by the look of things, heavily drunk. Salim bellowed, "Where's the mahout?" Jahan took a step forward, bowed low. "We been looking for you. We wish to ride the elephant." "Now, my sultan." The question was met with bursts of tittering while the sultan glowered. Jahan mumbled his apologies and hurried to the barn. Chota grumbled, not willing to abandon the land of dreams where he was stomping merrily. Half pleading, half threatening, Jahan was able to bring him out and put on the howdah. The sultan, the musician, the poet, and the minstrel climbed up. Jahan noticed the sultan had gained weight. He puffed as he made his way. The servants who had come with them were carrying baskets loaded with food and drink. With ropes each basket was hoisted into the howdah. Chota lifted Jahan with his trunk and placed him on his neck. In this state they began their nighttime promenade. Jahan thought they would stay inside the imperial gardens, but, as they reached the outer gate, he heard Salim say, "Keep going, mahout." "Where, my lord?" "Go, don't stop until I tell you." The guards, their eyes wide with astonishment, moved aside to let them pass. Chota, still sleepy and in an ill mood, plodded at a snail's pace, refusing to speed up despite Jahan's prodding. Inside the howdah, they didn't seem to mind. They were singing. The sound of a lute filled the air. They passed through the winding streets where nothing, not even a leaf or a shadow, stirred. "Mahout, stop," ordered the sultan. Jahan did as told. "Jump down." This, too, Jahan did. "Now catch." Giggling like children, they lowered a basket. Inside there was a wine bottle and a cup. The sultan said, "Drink." "My lord." "Come on. Do you have any idea how annoying the sober are to the merry?" Jahan filled the cup and downed it. A peal of laughter followed. The sultan, clearly amused, said, "Drink another." So it went. Before he knew it he had consumed the whole bottle. He asked Chota to pull him up, and, as the animal did so, Jahan's head spun like a cartwheel. He sat there, his face blotchy, his anguish hidden, until he heard the sultan say, "Tell me, mahout, have you ever been in love?" Jahan said, a little uncertainly, "All I know about love is that it brings heartache, your highness." From the howdah came the saddest melody, fluttering in the breeze like a feather from a bird long gone. The poet recited, "Behold the beauty that expands the heart within the mirror of the rose." In that moment Jahan thought that God, who must be watching them, would understand the pain and the fear that they felt for being so small, so perishable. He clapped heartily. His forwardness, which any other time would have brought trouble, was met with laughter and joy. All at once a howling voice pierced the air. "What the hell is going on?" In front of their eyes was a man, tottering. He had the raw look of someone who had just woken up. The doorway where they had stopped was his bed. Apparently too drunk to find his way home, he had dozed off there. Jahan tried to warn the poor fellow. He leaned over and whispered, "It's the Sultan sitting here. The man barked. He pointed at Selim. That's the Sultan. He pointed at the courtiers. These are the archangels, he pointed at Chota. This beast is the Zebani in hell. And I am dead. The Sultan broke in, what are you doing on the streets at this hour? Nothing, said the man. You can barely stand but you are searching for more drink, right? Don't lie. Have you no shame? Dazed, lost, the man leaned forward as if he wanted to kiss Chota's trunk. Searching, yes. But not wine. He patted his chest. I am looking for love. The courtiers chortled and so did the Sultan, despite his irritation. At this hour, on empty streets. You're hopeless. The drunk lifted his head, his arms folded over his chest. Maybe I am. But how about you? Jahan was worried sick. He dared not glance at the Sultan, fearing the punishment he would now inflict on this insolent subject. Yet when Selim spoke, again he sounded calm, almost compassionate. Catch. Something rattled on the cobblestones. The man picked it up and stared quizzically at the ring in his hand. The Sultan said, if you find what you're looking for, come to the palace and show my seal. Tell them you have a message for the Lord of the Empire. The drunk, only now realizing this really was the Sultan, lurched forward to kiss his hand or his hem or his feet, but, being unable to reach any of those, hugged Chota's leg instead. Stay away, Jahan said. You're going to get trampled. The man took a step back, lost for words, shaking, sweating, mumbling his gratitude, flummoxed and glad to be alive. Selim ordered, let's go, Mahout. On the way back they were silent and suddenly somber. Since they had arrived in the Ottoman palace, there were times when Chota had been neglected, even mistreated, but he had always been the one and only. There was no other elephant in the menagerie. No other royal elephant in the empire. Everything changed the day a carrack moored in the port of Galata. The month of April it was. The Judas trees were in full bloom, the city wrapped in perfume, when the ship dropped anchor. Among its cargo were 3 animals, a zebra, a giraffe, and an African bush elephant. They were brought to the palace on carts, wretched and ailing, after a harrowing voyage. The giraffe, with its black tongue and peaceful eyes, sadly did not survive for long. The zebra was sent off to the lion house. As for the elephant, a 20-year-old male that was named Mahmud, he recovered and stayed. Along with him came an unfriendly face, Buziba. By this time Chota had reached 30 years of age. Though not at all doddering in elephant years, he no longer had the agility of his heyday. Nonetheless, with each passing summer he had become smarter, sharper. Jahan now understood why battle-scarred warriors preferred aged elephants to young ones. Sound in body and limb as they might be, the youths tended to be foolhardy, like human beings. Mahmud was placed in the same barn as Chota while Buziba joined the other tamers in the shed. Initially, Jahan tried to give him a wide berth but it was impossible. Every evening they supped together, every afternoon they attended to their elephants side by side. Had Buziba heard what a hammam was, he gave no indication of it. He seldom bathed, if at all, and never cleaned his surroundings. Contrary to the custom in the palace, he ate noisily. At meal times Jahan avoided the seat beside him to avoid the crumbs he spewed left and right. Jahan wasn't the only one who was vexed by the newcomers. Chota, too, was perturbed, incensed. He resented Mahmud munching his hay, drinking his water, getting his treats. On occasion he would knock over the other's bucket or filch his food. An angry elephant was a dedicated avenger. One morning, when Jahan entered the barn, he found Chota stamping on the mantle that Buziba would throw upon Mahmud whenever they went out for a walk. "Shame on you!" Jahan hissed, keeping his voice level so as not to be heard by anyone else. "Get off that thing." Too late. The mantle was ground with grime. "What's the matter?" came Buziba's voice from behind. There was no point in denying Chota's misbehavior, and Jahan didn't try. "I shall clean it, I swear." Buziba picked up the cloth, but not before muttering under his breath something that Jahan took to be a curse. "You think I'm stupid? I know what's happening," he said, his voice not so much upset as satisfied. "You and your beast are jealous." "That's not true." "It is, for a reason. Soon you're going to be shown the door, the two of you. Anyone can see which elephant's better." Jahan opened and closed his mouth, unable to object. Someone had seen his innermost fear and said it out loud, and the universe had heard it. The next day the Sultan appeared accompanied by his courtiers. Just as Jahan moved to get Chota ready for a ride, Salim said, "Let's try the new elephant." Buziba threw himself to the ground, declaring that he and the animal would happily serve the sovereign of the House of Osman, the commander of the faithful and the successor of the Prophet, the shadow of God on earth, the most generous and the most virtuous and the most righteous of all rulers who had come to the throne and were yet to come. Jahan had never heard so many honeyed words, dripping with thick, sticky syrup. Even so, the Sultan seemed pleased. Like lightning, Chota's howdah was placed on Mahmud. Jahan's jacket was handed to Buziba, that awful jacket that Jahan had hated with his entire being but now thought the world of. While Jahan gnawed his lips and Chota swung his trunk back and forth, Mahmud and his mahout replaced them, just like that. Off they went. Even after they vanished from sight, the wind carried their sounds, or so Jahan thought in his misery. He caressed Chota, who coiled his trunk around Jahan's waist. They stayed like that for a good while, seeking refuge in each other's company. The next morning all hell broke loose. There was a pond behind the barn, surrounded by moss like a green, furry carpet. The water was no more than a puddle with fish, but Chota loved to spend time there. Jahan had obtained permission for him to take a dip every now and then, since Salim found the sight of an elephant splashing water rather endearing. When Chota and Jahan reached the pond, they found Mahmud settled in Chota's usual place. Next to him was Buziba, dangling his bare feet into the water, basking in the sunshine with his eyes closed, his mouth half open. Jahan considered his options. There was no point in starting a fight, which would reach the ears of the chief white eunuch and get him in trouble. Yet he could not let this pass. Chota stood beside him, quiet as a mouse, as though he, too, was considering his options. Gingerly, Jahan walked towards Buziba and tapped him on the shoulder. Yanked out of his reverie, he flinched. "What do you want? This spot belongs to Chota." Not a single emotion on his wooden face. Closing his eyes again, Buziba yawned and went back to swinging his feet lazily, as if Jahan and Chota weren't standing there waiting for a response. Jahan said grudgingly, "Let's go, Chota. We'll come back some other time." Jahan had barely taken a step when he heard a splash. Chota, that blessed soul, had done what he hadn't dared to do. Buziba, now in the pond, unleashed a curse, coughing, waving his hands. He clearly didn't know how to swim, and Jahan ran to him. "Take my hand, I'll pull you out." Buziba stopped, having just realized how shallow the pond was. Standing up, dripping water, he got out by himself and marched past them in a ball of fury. So it began. Their war. Every day they found a new excuse to be at each other's throats. Jahan could barely focus on work for Sinan, for fear that while he was away Buziba might harm Chota. He lost sleep, ate little. He recalled what Sinan, with a touch of compassion in his voice, had once said, balance is what keeps us upright. Same with buildings. Same with people. Jahan had lost his balance. Chota, too. The elephant spent the days staring ahead with fixed eyes. As though he wished, with all his being, to be beyond the walls of the barn he shared with his enemy. 2 weeks into this torment Jahan came up with a plan. By then the weather had become colder, and the summer was drifting away. Balaban's gypsies, recently back from Thrace, would soon be heading southwards. Jahan decided to visit them before they left. They welcomed him like a long-lost brother. Tamarind sherbets were served. Mouth-watering aromas surrounded them, sour grape molasses, goat's cheese, spinach pied, roasted meat. Children ran about, women smoked, grannies laughed toothless laughs. As they stuffed themselves, they inquired about the Sultan, eager to hear the latest palace gossip. Jahan explained how he'd had to give the guards a backhander in order to sneak out and that he had to return before the evening patrol. So what brings you here? Balaban wanted to know. I need help, Jahan said. Can we talk alone? No need. This is family, Balaban said, opening both hands. Leaning closer, Jahan dropped his voice to a whisper. Is there something that would make a male burn for a female? Balaban grinned. It's called love. Not like that. For mating. A powder or a drink that makes one desire. Balaban stopped chewing and regarded Jahan. You sick? Not for me. For an elephant. That beast needs no boost. What do you have against poor Gulbahar? Oh, it's not for Chota. Jahan told him everything, how he had lost his peace of mind because of another elephant and another mahout. He expected Balaban to make a wise crack at his expense, but when he finished the gypsy nodded solemnly and said, Don't sorrow. We'll help. Jahan took out the pouch he had brought and put it on the table. Is that from the Sultan or from you? Balaban inquired. The Sultan knows nothing about this. He shouldn't. Then keep it, Balaban said in his crisp, jovial way. Now go. We'll find you. Jahan returned to the menagerie. In his head a witch's brew fermented. Shame, hope, guilt. 2 days later a boy came looking for him, carrying a jar. Somebody sent you this. Jahan studied him, the bright black eyes, the dimpled smile, the olive skin. No doubt he was related to Balaban. Inside the jar there was a powder the color of turmeric. He dipped in the tip of his finger and tasted it. It had a mild flavor. A bit salty. It could blend into anything. Smuggling pomegranate sherbet from the kitchen, he mixed it with a spoonful of powder. The moment Buziba left he gave the drink to his elephant, who guzzled it happily. Not a thing happened. Next day he tried again, increasing the dose. Again, not. He poured the entire powder into Mahmud's rice gruel and watched the elephant cram it all down. As luck would have it, that night Sultan Selim appeared with his companions, eager for another session of merrymaking. Mahout, the Sultan exclaimed. Jahan bowed. Yes, my Sultan. Where is the other Mahout? Buziba came running, his face drenched in sweat. Your Majesty, the elephant is unwell. I beg you to forgive us for tonight. What's wrong with the beast? The Sultan demanded. As though in response a terrible sound came from the barn, followed by a crash. The Sultan headed towards the noise, the others following. It was the strangest sight. Mahmud, in his frenzy, had rammed into the wooden panel on the side of his stall, and one of his tusks had got jammed in the plank. He could move neither forward nor backward. His male organ was swollen, dripping. He bellowed, more with rage than with exasperation. No one dared to go near, including Buzaba. That was the end of Mahmud. Though he was released from the wooden plank, his fury and frustration did not subside. Eventually he had to be fettered. He broke his chains, knocked down the walls, charged into trees. Worse were the sounds he made, trumpeting, wailing, bawling. Before the month was over, Mahmud and Buzaba were sent to the old church near the Hagia Sophia. No one suspected anything, save Olef. "It was you, right?" he asked, his eyebrows moving together. When Jahan, already filled with remorse, did not respond, Olef went on, "I remember the day you arrived. Your elephant was an infant, so were you. I remember watching you and thinking to myself, how will he survive in the palace, a lad so good-hearted and gullible? Whereas now, look at you. You've become one of us, more's the pity." Jahan glanced up. "What does that mean?" "It means you fight battles that aren't needed," said Olef. "You are stronger. Beware, though. If you carry a sword, you obey the sword, not the other way round. Nobody can hold a weapon and keep their hands clear of blood at the same time." "I can, don't you worry for me," said Jahan. But as soon as he said this, he felt a sharp pang of regret, fearing that he may have tempted fate. Since the day Selim had ascended the throne, whenever Istanbul crushed his spirits, which happened often, he took off for Adrianople, the city where he had spent part of his youth. There he could hunt, loaf and drink to his heart's content, away from judging eyes and wagging tongues. Like every man who was aware of being widely disliked, the Sultan felt beholden to those who supported him. And the people of Adrianople always had. So several years into his reign Selim decided to reward this loyalty by commissioning a mosque, not in the capital, as expected, but in his sanctuary town. The moment it was announced that the sovereign would pay for a splendid mosque, the backbiting began. They said there was a reason why Istanbul had not been chosen. Having never commanded the army on a battlefield, the Sultan lacked the face to order so grand a monument in the seat of the throne. How could Selim's mosque be within close proximity to Suleiman's mosque, when the son could not hold a candle to the father? That is why, they said, the new construction could only have been in Adrianople. Words like black bile. Regardless, Sinan, and the 4 apprentices, laid the foundations for the Selimiye in April. The Sultan awarded his architect a robe of gold and silver, showing how much he trusted him. Everyone on the site, from woodworkers to the galley slaves, watched in anticipation, neither sanguine nor gloomy. Somehow they seemed to sense they were bringing into existence something unique. They labored with this knowledge, and this fear. It was a sin to create anything this lofty, as though to rival the Creator. The imams and the priests and the rabbis might not like to hear it, but deep inside they suspected that, sometimes, even God got jealous. The idea for a mosque had come to the Sultan in a dream. He beheld the Prophet Muhammad, recognizing him not from his face, since no earthling could see that, but from his aura. Selim promised him that should he conquer the island of Cyprus, he would build a fabulous Friday mosque with its spoils. The prophet gestured to the angels waiting by his side. Gliding in the air, glowing like fireflies, they disappeared and returned with a scroll. On it was the design of the Selimiye. Enchanted and excited, the next morning the Sultan did not want to wake up. When he ultimately did, he told what he had seen to his Grand Vizier. Sokala, shrewd and sharp as he was, believed that a ruler's dreams could be of two sorts. Those he should not share with anyone, not even with his Grand Vizier, and those he should ensure were made known to everyone. This, he deduced, was of the second kind. By midday, Sokala broached the subject with the Nishansi, the head of the Chancery. A man with a sweet tooth, he mentioned it to the head halva chef, who, in turn, related it to the merchant responsible for the nuts used in the royal kitchens. In the afternoon, the story left the palace in a pistachio cart, reaching the outskirts of Istanbul. From there it reached the streets of wool dyers and leather tanners. By the time the evening prayer was filling the air, hundreds had heard about it. Before the week was over, the whole city, including the Venetian bailo, had come to know that the prophet had demanded that the Sultan save Cyprus from the Christian infidels. Selim visited the tombs of his ancestors and the grave of Ayyub the martyr. The spirits gave him their blessing to wage a war. Yet, when the time came to embark, he did not go with the navy. The conquest would be made not by the Sultan's sword but by the Sultan's dream. The rewards would be huge. Nicosia was conquered and sacked until little remained of the town it once was. Famagusta, after being pummeled for months, was taken next, along with hundreds of captives. In the meantime, back in Adrianople, the chief royal architect and his apprentices were working their fingers to the bone. Sinan regarded each task as a cocoon in which to take shelter from storms of all kinds. Once he was within, he shunned the outside world. He had no interest in wars, much less in triumphs. Nevertheless, it was only after the capture of the island that the works gathered momentum. Tribute money poured in, bringing more workers, more materials. Oddly, as the mosque built in his name rose higher and higher, the Sultan descended lower and lower. The two of them, the man and the building, were inextricably linked in a profound yet inverted way, like night and day. For one to exist, the other had to perish. With every nail hammered, with each stone added onto the edifice, something was taken away from Selim: health, happiness, power and, ultimately, kismet. While working on one of the 8 massive piers of the Selimiye Mosque, one autumn afternoon, the master sent word to his apprentices that he wished to see them. Upon arriving at his tent, Jahan saw the others lingering by the entrance. He perched on a bench beside them, waiting for Sinan to end his meeting with some glassmakers. Davud looked dour and distrustful, as was his wont. He whispered, "Master would never tear the 4 of us away from work. There must be something gravely wrong." Thankfully, the glassmakers soon left, saving them from making foolish guesses. They found the master sitting on a carpet decorated with blossoming trees in the middle and a procession of deer, gazelles, tigers, and lions along the borders, woven in the city of Herat in Khorasan and presented to Sinan by a Kurdish beg for whom he had built an almshouse. In his right hand, propped up against cushions, Sinan held a rosary, which he thumbed slowly. Jahan knew that he carried a different one for each of his moods: the azure opal when he was immersed in thoughts, the yellow amber when blithe, the black onyx when eager to start a new project. Today it was the pale green barrel, which he took when preoccupied. On the low table in front of him was a cup of coffee and a glass of water. Next to them lay a sketch Jahan recognized, the Hagia Sophia. One by one they sat down on the carpet, facing the master. He was silent until they had settled. The sound of the beads, now moving faster, filled the air. Then he told them what had been preying on his mind. The area around the Hagia Sophia, over the years, had been packed with hovels, every one of which had been built unlawfully. Several complaints had been made to the chief Cadi of Istanbul, to no avail. At long last, seeing how desperate things were becoming, Sinan had sent a petition to the Sultan. In his letter he had criticized the ignorant men who, taking the cubit rule in their hands, had raised structures without any knowledge of the craft or care for the environs. Our Sultan considered his humble servant's request, Sinan said.